Para esas madres que son madres y padres y sueñan con un futuro mejor para sus hijos. Para esas abuelas que se convirtieron en madres una vez más, entregando lo mejor de sí. Para esos padres que a pesar del cansancio, siempre encuentran la fuerza para seguir. Para aquellos familiares que a pesar de la distancia, apoyan el futuro de los suyos. Con esfuerzo y esperanza, las familias construyen sueños. Con conocimiento, la UAO los transforma en realidad. Estudian la UAO.
En todos los rincones del mundo se escucha una voz que trasciende fronteras, conecta con historias de vida, viaja a través del tiempo y se adapta a nuevas formas de contar la información. Bienvenidos al Giro Podcast, Ciencia, Cultura y Ciudad.
Hello everyone, my name is Brooklyn Tucker, a senior international business major Spanish minor from Howard University.
Hello everyone, my name is Magdalena Marian Poling and I'm a junior at Carleton College where I'm studying biology and Latin American studies on the pre-medical track. We're both students studying here in Cali, Colombia with CET academic programs, and it has been a beautiful experience as we have both grown and learned academically and personally. We are here today because of our course here at WOW on history of armed conflicts in Colombia.
And through this class, we gained new perspectives on Colombia's history and present realities. And we are excited to welcome our viewers to our podcast where we explore the roots, actors, and consequences of Colombia's armed conflict. Coming from the United States, we realized we had a lot of preconceived ideas about Colombia, most of them shaped by telenovelas and shows like Narcos. But living here and studying this conflict firsthand has showed me that the story is much more deeper and more complex than the images suggest. And Lena, aren't you from Colombia?
Well, yes, Brooklyn. I was born in Bogota and adopted when I was a baby. Therefore, I had a slightly different experience as my parents taught me a lot about the food, music, and art of Colombia. I wanted to come here to learn more about Colombia and its rich culture and history and gain my own perspective on this country outside of how it is portrayed in the States. After my time here, I can see how much my perspective has been shaped by my life in the U.S. That is why this experience has been so valuable as I have been able to learn more about the history, politics, and everyday lives of Colombians. We are both very excited to get started with this first episode of our podcast. So, in today's episode, we want to dive into the history and roots of the Colombian armed conflict, exploring who the key actors were, what their motivations were, and how their strategies shaped not only politics and power, but also the everyday lives of Colombians. We hope you leave with an understanding of all the different kinds of violence that the people of Colombia experience and how rural areas specifically suffered, and how this makes it difficult to rebuild peace, trust, communities, and establish truth. Our hope is to go beyond textbook definitions and reveal the motives, mindsets, and realities of this conflict.
So, today we're going to be pulling from Basta Ya, a comprehensive report created by the Centro Nacional de Memoria Histórica. And to begin, I want to start with a testimony from a voice from Trujillo, Valle de Cauca. If one does not speak, does not write, and does not tell stories, one forgets, and little by little it's get covered by fear. People who saw the dead bodies begin to forget and are afraid to speak, so that we wind up carrying around a darkness that had lasted for years and nobody talks about. And since nobody talks about what happens, nothing has happened. So if nothing has happened, then we continue to live as nothing has happened. Wow, so powerful. And that's our goal today, is to truly speak and share what we've learned as a step forward to building a better tomorrow.
When most people think about the armed conflict in Colombia, they picture soldiers and armed groups. But in reality, many of these casualties were civilians. In fact, around 80% were civilians. And even that number doesn't capture the full reality due to the mass underreporting and a lot of research still being done to understand the full impact of armed conflict.
Yes, and Colombia's armed conflict didn't happen all at once and varied in intensities through decades of exclusion, inequality, and struggles for power. It's also important to understand that all these armed agents incorporate attacks on civilians as part of their war strategies. While their specific methods and intensities varied, the civilian population was constantly targeted and affected to achieve control and power. The armed groups would dehumanize civilians in this context, often viewing them as an extension of the enemy or just mere collateral damage.
Exactly. To understand these patterns, it helps to look briefly at the origins of guerrilla groups. They emerged in the 1960s after the National Front, during a period when violence had shifted from the bipartisan conflict to subversive movements confronting the state. Many rural communities felt abandoned by the government, with little access to land, education, or political power, and saw no political space for their demands. Inspired by broader revolutionary currents in Latin America, small groups of peasants, students, and activists took up arms as a way to pursue change.
And two of the most prominent groups was FARC, or the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, and the ELN, or the National Liberation Army. Both claimed to defend the poor and challenge the state, but over time their tactics, such as kidnapping, selective assassinations, attacks on civilian population, terrorist attacks, illegal recruitment, and selective forced displacement, and involvement in the drug trade. So you see how it starts to blur their political goals and deepen the country's violence. When we look at their tactics, guerrilla groups are largely defined by attacks on liberty and property. Their main goal were to weaken the state and paramilitaries, gain political control, challenge government policies, and impose a new social order. One of their most notorious strategies were kidnapping, used both for economic and political leverage. They often targeted members of the elite to fund their operations or pressure the government into prisoner exchanges. These acts weren't isolated. They included mass kidnappings and so-called miraculous catches, where civilians were taken directly from buses or highways, spreading fear across the country.
Yes, and within this period of violence, there were 27,023 kidnappings, and around 9 out of every 10 were done by guerrilla groups, with FARC and ELN being the main perpetrators.
Wow, so is it safe to say guerrilla groups use kidnapping as their main tactic, especially against elites and people in power in the government?
Correct. And they were also responsible for 84.1% of documented damages to civilian property. This included sabotage of infrastructure like electricity towers and roads to isolate towns and disrupt economic activity, aiming to establish a violent reputation and destabilize the state.
Wow. So they also use massacres and terrorist attacks. Strategically, though a lot less than paramilitaries, often as retaliation to the other actors and usually they were tied to the fall or creation of peace negotiations. But they did use child recruitment as a main strategy, often targeting vulnerable youth and poverty who lack opportunities. They were viewed as cheap manpower and easier to train and control. Actually, 5 out of every 10 former guerrilla members joined as children, many against their will, with their families being threatened if they didn't join.
That's a lot to unpack. I want to note that treatment and actions in a region were shaped by 2 types of anchoring that armed groups established there. Basta identifies these 2 types. The first type is primary anchoring, which is rooted in the community or even emerging from it. These towns were labeled as guerrilla towns, which groups used to justify violence against residents. The other type was unstable anchoring, which was seen in 2 kinds of areas: places with economic and political integration, like cattle ranching or commercial agriculture zones. And the second area was places experiencing economic booms, with economies like coca, banana plantations, oil fields, or mines, usually in rural zones. Now we want to switch to discussing about paramilitaries, which were initially created as self-defense groups against guerrillas, but soon they became involved in massacres, land dispossession, forced disappearances, assassinations, and alliances with state forces and business elites. Their violence is primarily characterized by attacks against the physical integrity of a person with the goal of establishing a terrifying reputation and using it to build fear.
And they also aim to establish and maintain complete control over entire regions, often clashing with guerrilla groups and using violence to eliminate political enemies. They also punish local populations for their electoral choices or for what they perceive to be support from the guerrilla members. And I say perceive because in many cases, that accusation was simply an excuse to justify their actions. They used violence to seize land by forcibly displacing communities and to impose economic blockades that restricted local activity. An example of this is with their scorched earth tactics or extermination attacks that destroyed everything in their path to penetrate into the areas that were difficult to reach as they were in the mountains or jungles. They attacked to stop guerrilla groups from expanding, weaken the groups, and to gain control over the area and people, and to send a political message of dominance, to scare civilians, and again, to weaken the guerrilla groups. And also, drug trafficking networks were a defensive force, providing the resources that sustained and intensified the paramilitary violence.
Yes, and the number tells a chilling story of paramilitaries enacting 58.9% of all documented massacres. These were central to their strategy designed to sow terror, cause exile, and destroy communities. While large massacres built their reputation, small massacres, which were usually 4 to 6 victims, were more common and reinforced concealment. They are also responsible for 38% of selective assassinations, which were often combined with public display of tortured corpses to cause social destabilization. An example of this is from Basaya, and it starts like this. On the bridge of the Gumes River, we managed to recover 7 bodies. Those bodies were opened at the thorax, others had their throats slit. What a young man who managed to survive told us that the paramilitaries began by taking people off the trucks, and with axes and knives they cut open their stomachs.
Wow. That just really shows the level of cruelty that paramilitary groups would enact against the Colombian people, which is also shown by the fact that they are responsible for over 63% of the documented cases of extreme cruelty. This included horrific practices like decapitation, gutting, as you mentioned, and burning. And these cruelties were even taught in quartering schools as part of military training. And this reinforced their terrifying reputation and willingness to go to the extreme. They also used forced disappearance to complement other terror tactics, and to really hide the true scale of the violence and to avoid state intervention. And for military training, where victims were randomly captured and used for practice, where bodies were often incinerated in arsenal ovens or thrown into the rivers to hide the evidence.
There is also a high prevalence of sexual assault victims, often used as a calculated weapon of war. Objectives include attacking women leaders, destroying emotional bonds with perceived enemies, pushing transgressive behaviors, and strengthening group cohesion through shared violence. It was all about shame and control. Women were treated terribly, as is shown in this quote. We lived like animals, shamed with a poor diet, not just in terms of nutrition, but also the amount of food. You ask yourself, what you could have done to deserve such suffering and torment, what crime you have committed so that everything that makes you a person is taken away from you. They also used coercion and violence to force farmers off land, then seize the best territories. Extortion became a tax for inhabitants in controlled areas, highly underreported due to threats. The paramilitaries extorted the people in rural areas that were ignored by the government.
With that, it's very important to now switch topics and talk about the security forces, which includes the military service of the Colombian Army, Air Force, Navy, and police, and how their actions shaped this conflict as well. Their main goal was to defeat the guerrillas and restore state control, especially under policies like the Democratic Security Strategy, but the intense pressure to show results led to serious human rights abuses. Many soldiers were rewarded for kills, which gave a rise to false positives, which is a scandal where civilians were killed and falsely reported as guerrillas to boost statistics. And the security forces committed over 2,304 false positives.
Beyond combat, the security forces justified abuses by labeling civilians as guerrilla supporters. They also collaborated with paramilitary groups, sharing intelligence or conducting joint operations. One tragic example was in the Santo Domingo massacre of 1998. A Colombian Air Force helicopter dropped a cluster bomb on a village, killing 17 civilians, including 6 children.
And there are also reports of sexual violence where soldiers abused women in conflict zones, particularly those accused of sympathizing with guerrillas. So while the security forces aimed to restore order, their actions deepened mistrust, fueled the conflict, and left lasting scars on communities as they engaged in arbitrary detentions, torture, disappearances, and sometimes even collusion with paramilitaries.
And something really important here, is that part of the security forces' role in all this was that the state itself wasn't simply absent, it was fragmented. In some regions, there was a strong military presence, in others, almost none. And in many places, the state was present, but co-opted by paramilitaries or captured by local elites. This uneven state presence shaped exactly which armed groups took control and how violence played out for the communities living there. Part of this dynamic as well was the country's relationship with illicit economies and unidentified armed groups that further complicated the war.
Wait, so is this where Narcos comes in?
Yes. During the 1980s and 1990s, powerful cartels like in Medellin and in Cali became major actors. Their motivations weren't just for money. They also used violence to pressure the government and resist extradition to the United States. Escobar's war against the state turned into outright terrorism, with bombings of airplanes, police buildings, and newspapers throughout the late 80s and early 90s. And behind it all were criminal alliances. Drug traffickers financed and coordinated with paramilitaries and even state forces, fueling selective assassinations and forced disappearances like those seen in the Trujillo massacre.
Yes, and we see the start of this to form when the guerrilla group M19 kidnapped Martha Nieves Ocha, the sister of one of the founders of the Medellin cartel. In retaliation, Pablo Escobar and other cartel leaders formed a group called MAS, or Muerte a sus Agresores, or Death to Kidnappers, which began as a response to one kidnapping, soon evolved into a network of vigilante and paramilitary forces, targeting not just guerrillas, but anyone suspected of sympathizing them. And we see that pattern a lot. And that moment marked one of the first alliances between drug traffickers and armed groups, again further blurring the lines between organized crime and counterinsurgency.
So, in the end, these groups blurred the lines between crime, politics, and war, and all for control and power or the illusion of stability, making Colombia's conflict even more violent and difficult to untangle.
Yes, and at the same time, a large portion of the violence came from unidentified armed groups, cases where investigators couldn't determine who was responsible. And this reflects how effectively different armed actors concealed their crimes. And these groups were tied to nearly 15% of the massacres and over 27% of selective assassinations, with most forced disappearance never clearly attributed to anyone.
So when we look at all this together, it wasn't just one group or one type of violence. It was a web of actors, each with their own motives and strategies.
Exactly, and by breaking down each of these dimensions, we could see how the armed conflict shaped everyday lives in Colombia, not just during the height of the violence, but even today. Now that we walk through the history and the main actors, we want to step back and reflect what all this means, especially for civilians.
Civilians weren't just caught in the crossfire. They were often the direct target through massacres, selective killings, displacement, and other forms of violence.
And the impact wasn't felt equally. Afro-Colombians, indigenous, and poor communities, many of whom lived in rural and research-rich regions, often bore the brunt of displacement and violence. Their territories became battlegrounds, and their communities still face lasting consequences today. This is especially true in the Pacific region, as an area rich in natural resources and essential to Colombia's biodiversity. In other courses on environment, conflict territories, and ethnic groups, we learn how communities there were abandoned and impacted by corporations and illegal market precisely because their territories are so resource rich. And Slow Violence and Corporate Greening in the War on Drugs in Colombia by Diego Luego Vivas y Irene Velez Torres, the authors show how rural areas have been shaped by cocoa cultivation after being abandoned by the state and left at the mercy of armed groups. With few opportunities, limited education, and scarce resources, residents are left with a few options for survival. This all shows how armed conflict, illicit economies, or poverty are connected, but others will dive more into this later in our podcast.
Yes, thank you for sharing that, Brooklyn. Even in cities like Medellin or Bogota, fear and distrust shaped daily life. Families were divided, youth were recruited, and communities learned to live with constant uncertainty. Violence also looked different across the country. It depended on the region, the armed group, and the local economy and the time period. Violence isn't always physical. It also is when someone's potential is limited. It makes me wonder, how many children lost access to education? How many people were prevented from earning a living? How many communities were fractured in ways that can't be easily repaired? The loss of land, culture, community, and family ties show how deeply violence reshapes life in Colombia. Because of each area's unique experience and how they experience conflict differently, there isn't one single path towards justice or peace. Repairing what's been broken requires understanding of those differences.
So the big questions we're left here is, how do you heal from something like this? What does justice look like for victims, and especially those from marginalized groups?
And also, how do you make sure this doesn't happen again? What is the balance between healing justice and truth while also trying to prevent further violence? That's a challenge that Colombia continues to face today, as it has been trying to build peace in its communities and as a country.
In this story of Colombia's conflict, in many ways, a story about what happens when exclusion, inequality, and voices go unchecked. But also what Basta Yat begins to hint at is hope. Hope for the future, as groups work to uncover the truth of what happened in Colombia and incorporate communities better in the peace-building process so that they feel that they have received justice. As it's not only through telling the truth and creating clarity, but it's only that through truth and telling the truth and creating clarity that the nation will be able to heal.
Yes, thank you, Brooklyn. Well, everyone, this is the end of our episode. We hope that from our episode you learned something and were able to reflect on the history of armed conflict in Colombia. We hope you can see the complexity of this history and that this will all give you context as we look at how Colombia is trying to build peace and stability.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome to episode 2.
The role of drug trafficking in illicit economies. My name is Makai Hunt.
And I am Zaina Hopkins, and our episode focuses on the role of drug trafficking and illicit economies in the Colombian conflict. How are you doing today, Kai?
I'm doing good. I'm really happy to be here to talk about this important topic. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Yeah, I'm really excited to get into it. I think this is going to be a good episode. I'm curious, before we get into sort of some of what our sources talked about, I want to turn to you, and I'm curious, what were some of your ideas about Colombia before arriving here?
So before coming to Colombia, the only thing I really knew was like there was a huge salsa presence, and then I knew there was some type of history about armed conflict and like drug trade, but I didn't really know like all the details behind it.
For sure. I feel like I was in a similar position, and I feel like especially when I was speaking to people like 1 or 2 generations above me who were growing up in the 80s, 90s, that time period, a lot of what they talked about was like narco trafficking, the name Pablo Escobar, these very like superficial ideas about drug trafficking and illicit economies in Colombia. So in our episode, we hope to dig deeper, to look at the complexities of this beyond the superficial. And combining a historical, empirical, and testimonial evidence, we hope to present a more complex analysis of drug trafficking and illicit economies in Colombia. Kai, walk us through the structure of our episode.
Of course. So first, we will explore the relationship between drug trafficking and armed groups. Then we will discuss the social and economic impact of drug trade on affected communities. From there, we will move into the impact of the war on drugs on the armed conflict and drug trafficking. To conclude, we will look ahead to post-conflict drug trade.
Awesome. Let's get into it. To start us off, we're going to talk a little bit about the landscape of coca cultivation in the Andean region. So coca is native to the Andean region. The Andean region includes Bolivia, Peru, and Colombia. And its consumption in leaf form is a long-standing tradition and a custom among Andean farmers. This region cultivates the most coca in the world globally at 200,000 hectares. But in recent years, Colombia emerged as a disproportionate dominator of coca cultivation after successful eradication efforts in Bolivia and Peru. It is important to highlight that, contrary to popular belief, this crop expansion is a consequence of the Colombian armed conflict rather than a cause of the conflict. To further understand the impact and reaction of this crop expansion, we must first establish the main actors that will be discussed. Insurgency groups, particularly the FARC that we heard discussed in the previous episode, are central to understanding the dynamics between political, territorial, and economic control as they relate to illicit economies. The state, as well as state-backed paramilitary forces, are important actors to understand the response to the dominance of insurgency groups in drug trafficking. Finally, everyday civilians must be included to understand the lasting impact of illicit economies on the lives of Colombians. It is important to note that although it is not extensively discussed in this episode, land and territory were also victims of illicit economies and the war on drugs, which will be discussed in a later episode. Drug trafficking is a self-supporting economy for insurgency groups. Drug trafficking is not only a display of territorial control, it also, quote, has the double function of offering the groups a social base in terms of the labor force involved and the income they need to escalate and expand their armed struggle, unquote. Insurgency groups fill the role of regulating the drug trade. Additionally, the longevity and scale of insurgency groups were possible because of profits from the drug trade. So Kai, given how lucrative illicit economies are, I'd assume that economic factors are the main determinant of involvement for armed groups. Like, Kai, is this what our investigations have revealed?
So although it may seem like economic goals drive the involvement of insurgency groups in the drug trade and illicit economies, political and military goals take the precedent over economic goals. For instance, FARC initially prohibited coca cultivation given its misalignment with their anti-capitalist ideology. However, after pushback from their peasants' social base, they shifted their stance. Open quote, despite the social ills of drug trade, the FARC's peasant social base economically benefited from the cultivation of illicit crops. In fact, the profit gains from illicit coca cultivation far exceeded those of illicit crops. Hence, the FARC's prohibitionist stance alienated their peasant social base and threatened to undermine political dominance in the region. What is more, peasants sought protection from the crime and disorder that accompanied the drug trade, and from predatory traffickers and the state's security forces. Hence, by the exploring the drug trade, the FARC gained not just economically but politically. End quote.
That's fascinating, and that's definitely not what I initially assumed. Through our investigations, I'm also struck by this rapid growth we see of illicit crops. Between 1990 and 1998, in regions with illicit crops, the percentage of FARC combatants engaged in economic protection activities increased from 20 to 33%. So that's 13 percentage points up in only 8 years. The monopolization of crop cultivation in an attempt to control territory militarized FARC's involvement in the drug trade. When these military goals took presidency, FARC's popular support declined.
Okay, so Xana, so far you've talked a lot about large groups such as FARC and paramilitary groups. I'm wondering if you can expand a bit more on the structural violence we see when looking at who cultivates coca and where.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Kai. Yeah, an examination of who and where coca is cultivated reveals structural violence. Illicit drug businesses are most prevalent in economically precarious zones. Displacement of Colombians as a consequence of the drug-based economy disproportionately affects poorer, rural, and indigenous people. And I think we see the most revealed when we look at the smallest scale. So much of this coca production is happening on a small scale. Between 2005 and 2008, household coca cultivation increased from 68,600 Colombian households to 166,000 100,000 Colombian households. So that's double in just 3 years, which is absurd, yeah. So this continuum of violence in which everyday Colombians are reliant on an illicit economy and live with armed groups rather than the state as authority figures makes it difficult to break out of the cycle of violence.
Okay, so it's pretty clear that Colombian economy is inseparable from the history of illicit economies. Can we get into the response of drug trafficking?
Yeah, for sure. So we can't talk about this economy without also talking about the Colombian government's response to it. So yes, I love that question. We've heard a lot about the war on drugs in the US context, but coming into Colombia, I didn't know much about the Colombian government's war on drugs. The war on drugs and other state-backed interventions have been highly ineffective, similar to the US. Aerial fumigation began in the 1970s against marijuana plants and significantly increased between 1994 and the early 2000s. As one expert notes, the nature of the demand for drugs makes aerial fumigation highly ineffective. Open quote. Effective repression in one region simply displaces production and trafficking to another zone, as long as demand remains dynamic due to the simple nature of the means of production and the extensive geographical possibilities. End quote. So I sort of think of like the comparison, the analogy I use is the game of whack-a-mole, where the quantity of drugs is the same, but you knock it out in one area and it just pops up in another area, especially because coca as a crop is a very reliant crop and able to grow in a range of climates. So the war on drugs was highly ineffective. And this aerial fumigation disproportionately affected indigenous communities. These chemicals led to a slow economic violence against land and its people. In 1999, Colombian President Andrés Pastrana signed Plan Colombia, a US-Colombia agreement to end armed conflict and escalate drug eradication efforts.
Okay. So I'm hearing a lot of similarities between the Colombian war on drugs and the war on drugs in the United States. Black urban communities in the U.S. also had a lot of setbacks from the war on drugs that are still felt today. During this period, there was an unprecedented spike in African American men and women in jails due to sentencing disparity, a 100-to-1 ratio between crack and powder cocaine, meaning that individual that got caught with 5 grams of cocaine will get the same punishment as someone that got caught with 500 grams of cocaine. And this was, 5 grams of crack cocaine. And this was due because the government thought that since crack cocaine was made with more chemicals, that it had a greater effect on the community, like of the United States, when in reality, after going through lots of tests and research, that there was the same effects from crack cocaine and powder cocaine. And then later, through research and investigation, we've seen that was due to the president at the time wanting to keep crack cocaine in urban communities and not let it spread outside of those communities. And the increase in incarceration also led to many social setbacks as well. Like, for example, for individuals that got put in prison, when you got out during that time frame in the late 1900s to the early 2000s, it was very hard to become back as a normal citizen after you were released. So like a lot of your rights were stripped, like voting rights, being able to get like government aid for you and your family. So it just made it really harder for the greater good of people that were in urban communities that were affected by the sentencing disparity.
Yeah, I hear a lot of parallels there. That's a really interesting comparison. So to wrap us up, let's look ahead to the complexities of peace building, considering the regulatory role insurgency groups play. In many ways, the relationship between the FARC and coca cultivation resembles the Taliban and poppy cultivation in Afghanistan. Open quote. Evidence from Afghanistan suggests that the drug trade will not only persist post-conflict, but could become more violent. Close quote. FARC played a more regulatory role than a participatory role in the drug trade. Even though insurgency groups are outside of the government apparatus, they still function as regulators. This reality provides complexities for interventions to illicit economies.
So after this long discussion about drug trafficking and illicit economies, we want to leave you all with one question to reflect on.
What are the complexities of peace-building efforts, considering that insurgency groups are integrated into the regulation of illicit economies?
Thank
you for tuning in.
Hi, my name is Kat Skillings, and I'm a junior at Kenyon College, double majoring in International Studies and Spanish with a concentration in Latine Studies.
And I'm Dimitri Mamateusz, a junior at Williams College, double majoring in Computer Science and Spanish. Today, we welcome you to episode 3 of Abroad and Aware, a journey through the roots, actors, and consequences of Colombia's armed conflict. In our episode, we'll be taking a look at the topic into the social, political, and economic impacts of armed conflict. Though we're both studying the topic of race and identity in Colombia for this semester, something which has been, and still is, greatly shaped by the past and present of armed conflict.
We especially wanted to assess the emotional consequences of the Colombian armed conflict over a long-term scale for individuals directly and indirectly impacted by the armed conflict.
Much of our investigation is based on Chapter 4 of the Basta Ya document, which was originally published by the Centro Nacional de Memoria Histórica in Spanish in the summer of 2013, and later published in English in 2016. Basta Ya is based on research conducted between 2007 and 2012 by the Grupo de Memoria Histórica, a government body which serves to receive, recover, conserve, compile, and analyze any materials related to, quote, the violations that occurred on the occasion of the Colombian internal armed conflict, through the realization of research, museum activities, pedagogical, among others. As they pose their vision statement, with all our memories, we contribute to comprehensive reparation, cultural transformation, and peace.
Now, the armed conflict in Colombia has had complex and diverse impacts on victims, families, communities, organizations, institutions, and Colombian society as a whole. This is due to the many factors that have shaped and continue to shape this armed conflict.
These factors include the nature of the violence, the kind of victimizers, the modalities of violence, considerations about the victims, the social responses, and the actions of the state. Kat, would you be able to explain a bit more about what all those factors actually mean?
Yeah, of course. So, when we say the kind of victimizers, we're referring to who carried out the violence, for example, paramilitary groups, guerrilla groups, or the state, just as some examples. The modalities of violence are the various ways in which violence exists, occurs, and is experienced, something we'll get a little bit further into later. Now, considerations about the victims include whether or not they were directly or indirectly experiencing violent events, as well as demographic factors such as age, gender, ethnicity, group affiliations, and the support systems that they were or were not a part of during and after the occurrence of violent events. Social responses include responses both to the events themselves and to those affected. For example, whether or not they were supported. And finally, the actions of the state refer to the ways in which the Colombian state reacted to the violence of and occurrences of the armed conflict, which does also include a lack of action or response from the state. These definitions all come from Chapter 4 of Basta Ya.
Thank you for that. Another way to understand the impacts of armed conflict is by understanding the categories of harm which occur. Chapter 4 also makes reference to 4 categories of harm: emotional and psychological, moral, political, and sociocultural. These categories include material and environmental harms, which have deep and interconnected impacts on economic and sociocultural harms.
And now to call back to a term we mentioned earlier, a key factor involved in these harms and their impacts are the forms that the violence takes, combined with considerations about the victims, or what the Chapter 4 of Basta Ya was describing as the modalities of violence.
Right. So based on this framework, we wanted to look especially into the emotional and psychological impacts and harms. Clearly, it's valuable to understand the more quantitative impact of armed conflict, things like economic statistics or mortality and casualty rates, given that these details play massive roles in shaping the current Colombian socio-political landscape. However, it's just as crucial to consider the more invisible elements, like emotional or psychological harms.
Thanks so much for calling attention to the importance of considering these consequences. Really, we wanted to look a little bit further than Basta Ya does in looking into these impacts and harms, specifically to investigate the sustained emotional and psychological harms of the armed conflict on adolescent victims and victims who were not directly victimized during the conflict. This could look like children of victims born elsewhere after family members were displaced and thus removed from direct conflict, or individuals living in or raised in communities where the violence of the armed conflict was really significant, but who may not have had as many personal interactions or experiences with violence.
Right. We wanted to try to understand the nature of armed conflict in Colombia as a larger, multi-generational process. Thus, understanding the intergenerational impacts, emotional and other, will serve as our key line of analysis to better understand the question of the true scale and impact of Colombia's armed conflict. As the article, The Intergenerational Effects of War on the Health of Children notes, the short and medium-term effects of conflict on population health are reasonably well documented. Less considered are its consequences across generations and potential harms to the health of children yet to be born. In essence, we want to try to get at the following question: how does this conflict or experience shape and impact generational existences, understandings, moralities, perspectives, expectations, and/or sociocultural norms?
So now that we have that guiding question, let's take a step back to present the groundwork for the investigation that we've done, starting from Basta Ya Chapter 4, which highlights the specific ways in which emotional and psychological impacts have occurred for victims of the armed conflict. One key concept that the chapter establishes is that fear was the most constant and generalized feeling experienced by victims involved in the Grupo de Memoria Histórica research. On page 267, it mentions that victims experience constant anxiety because of the presence of, quote, armed men at their rural districts and homes, as well as insecurity about traveling because of roadblocks by armed forces and illegal armed groups. Victims experience fears about being, quote, interrogated, detained, tortured, or murdered by the armed groups that used to interrogate and try them along the highways.
Another major fear that was mentioned was that of children being recruited to or becoming victims of sexual violence by armed groups. All these fears are extremely significant and have life-altering impacts on victims, especially considering that victims are still afraid despite the passage of time, even years after the occurrence of violent events. This fear has paralyzing and mortifying effects on many, to the extent that, quote, some could not carry on the activities that were essential for their development of their lives.
This fear has also restricted family and community initiatives to resume their projects. There's a really strong image that's included in this chapter of Tulia Rosa Perez from La Hormiga Putumayo, taken in November of 2007, when she finally received the remains of her daughter who was disappeared by paramilitaries in 2001. The remains were returned to her by the Justice and Peace Unit of the Office of the Attorney General. And in this image, she's holding on to the remains of her daughter and weeping on top of them. And it's just really, really, really strong and goes to show just how deep these impacts have been on victims, as well as the ways in which the state has reacted, considering that she only received her daughter's remains in 2007 while she was disappeared in 2001.
And it's crazy to imagine how many people don't even receive the remains of their children or family members or loved ones.
Exactly. Now, this chapter also suggests a, quote, climate of terror that was instilled by armed actors through forms of violence such as massacres, tortures, forced displacements, selective assassinations, sexual violence, and unlawful recruitments. This climate of terror led victims to, quote, experience permanent feelings of menace and vulnerability.
The result of this trauma is often the adoption of mechanisms of protection like silence, distrust, and isolation, which significantly altered family and community dynamics and relationships. Fear also dissuaded individuals from denouncing the crimes, seeking justice, and participating in social or political organizations. Many victims isolated themselves through means like hiding out in their homes, and, quote, severely restricted their relations and conversations in the surroundings their families had moved in. These are all still really coming from page 267 in large, but from across the chapter.
Also experienced were feelings of anger and hatred. These are largely the result of impunity or a lack of punishment for victimizers. Now, though victims experience these feelings of anger and hatred, they're often repressed, especially in places of collective conversation. And this repression can lead to other negative emotional responses like guilt and shame, because social norms have often stigmatized, rejected, and condemned expressing these feelings of anger and hatred.
Right, and those repressed emotions have to go somewhere, and so they're often redirected against other people, especially the most fragile, like minors, which stems from a lack of proper outlets for acknowledging or processing these emotions. Feelings of guilt and shame have also been observed in many other instances, and for victims of various forms of violence, such as women who were victims of sexual violence, men who felt incapable of protecting their families, and communities who were singled out and blamed or made to feel responsible for the violence that they experienced.
Now, the chapter also describes a, quote, privatization of harm that, quote, weakens or prevents people from acknowledging those who are really responsible for the crimes, and can lead to a breakdown in personal decisions, relationships, and interpersonal interactions. Traumas and psychological and psychosomatic harms have also been caused by exposure to high levels of terror and defenselessness.
Right. So from here, let's go into some more research about the intergenerational impacts of the Colombian armed conflict that aren't discussed as thoroughly in Basta Ya. If we can see how hard it is for the people who've experienced this, I wonder what that leads to for their children.
Yeah. So as we began establishing earlier, we see an intergenerational approach oriented around emotional understanding as a preferable method of analysis for the armed conflict, particularly when we're answering questions pertaining to the bigger systems of armed conflict and subsequent recovery.
For us, this emotional emphasis is valuable and merits further research and emphasis because it provides a uniquely flexible yet thorough framework to discuss anything and everything related to the armed conflict and its consequences. Something we've hinted at but haven't said out loud is that, as much as armed conflict can be and is understood as a large-scale, systematic problem, understanding and resolving these harms is a task that can only be accomplished by working from the ground up. That is to say, change has to be made first on the personal and local level before any bigger adjustments can happen. To effectively use this bottom-up approach, we must understand emotional and psychological considerations. Viewing groups as the sum of individuals who have experienced unique emotional and psychological impacts of the armed conflict, rather than just as groups to be governed, helps explain nuances that quantitative analysis often misses.
Also, a strong grasp of these individual psychological aspects also strengthens the top-down group analysis. It allows us to distinguish between actions motivated by individuals and those driven by collective desire, enabling more comprehensive analysis of group dynamics with less oversimplification, provided that we remember that collectives are still the sums of individuals. To truly understand societal decisions, their impacts, and pathways to peace, especially regarding armed conflict, we first need to address the individual pain, confusion, and needs of those affected. This focus on emotional elements can yield more immediate, actionable solutions. Now, let's look at some research that will help us to answer our guiding question, using this bottom-up approach.
Right, and rather than doing an in-depth analysis of any one article, we thought it'd be a valuable alternative to instead provide some brief reviews of research published in the past 5 years or so. We hope that this can help you to serve as a jumping-off point if you have any interest in further exploring the topic, and if nothing else, that it just gives you a little more exposure to the long-term consequences of this, which, as we've mentioned, really do merit further investigation.
So to start off, an article published in July of this year, titled, quote, Impact of Intergenerational Trauma on Second-Generation Descendants, a Systematic Review, focuses on the effects of collective traumas on descendants of survivors. Aligning with our argument, the abstract notes, quote, understanding how these traumas are transmitted across generations is essential to inform effective interventions and policy responses. The findings indicate that physiological changes in stress regulation and brain structure suggest biological embedding of trauma across generations. Socially, intergenerational trauma shaped relationships and identity, often fostering mistrust and emotional restraint. Psychologically, descendants showed elevated distress and trauma symptoms, with parental PTSD as a key predictor.
Another significant article, titled Cognitive Skills and Mental Health Among Child Victims of Armed Conflicts and Conditions of Socioeconomic Vulnerability in Colombia, was published in July of 2023. This study, quote, sought to identify cognitive, emotional, and social cognition states and characteristics of a child population who were victims of forced displacement that was caused by the armed conflict in Colombia. This study's findings suggest that significant cognitive impairments have been caused for children who experienced forced displacement because of the armed conflict. Some of these cognitive impairments were observed in tasks related to cognitive flexibility, inhibitory control, and social cognition. These findings also suggest that these challenges are present for children living in socially vulnerable environments.
Now, another investigation titled Growing Up Amidst Violence, Mapping Mental Health Ecologies with Young People on Colombia's Pacific Coast, was published in April of 2025 and focused on young Afro-Colombian people living in the city of Quibdó on the Pacific Coast. The study indicated that participants largely drew support from those in their immediate support systems, including family and friends, community activities like arts and sports, interacting with culture and nature, and using individual coping mechanisms. These support systems were disrupted because of the violence of the armed conflict. The findings of the study indicated that these young people involved in the research were disconnected from each other, their immediate environments, and the aforementioned support systems, as well as those offered by state and community organizations. It goes on to suggest that the existence of safe spaces where young people can express themselves, connect with others, and build trusting relationships is a key factor in connecting young people impacted by armed conflict to further resources for mental health care, as well as social, economic, peacebuilding, and broader political processes.
Finally, a paper published in 2014, titled The Intergenerational Effects of War on the Health of Children, takes a more qualitative approach, seeking to characterize and define the results of conflict. It provides a framework for considering the intergenerational effects of conflict that includes violence, challenges to mental health, infection, and malnutrition. It suggests that, quote, conflict-driven harms are transmitted through a complex, permissive environment that includes biological, cultural, and economic factors, and feedback loops between sources of harm and weaknesses in individual and societal resilience to them. In this way, the effects of conflict can be passed on across generations, and do so in many ways. This study also suggests that further research on the intergenerational effects of armed conflict is crucial. If you do only look at one study, I would suggest it be this one for its more thorough definition-based approach and the inclusion of a number of useful and intriguing figures to represent this topic and findings.
Now, with all that being said, Research like this is so crucial because it provides an understanding of the complexity of issues that must be addressed in Colombia's transitional justice process and the recuperation from all of the diverse harms and effects of the armed conflict. Some of these articles also provide specific mechanisms through which these psychological and emotional harms can be repaired and reckoned with. All in all, though understanding the intergeneration my bad. All in all, through understanding the intergenerational psychological and emotional impacts of the Colombian armed conflict, transitional justice processes can more comprehensively and effectively work to repair and rebuild Colombian society.
With all that said, I'd like to say thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you, Kat, for talking with us about me, and I'll see you guys maybe.
Oh yeah.
Hi, and welcome to episode 4, Hidden Voices, Women as Victims in Armed Conflict. My name's Abida Hassan. I'm a senior at Northwestern University and from Chicago.
And I am Sandra Tienda. I'm a junior at Kalamazoo College, majoring in Women's Studies and Art History.
And how lucky we are to have an expert in women's studies with us here today, since in this episode, we will be discussing the systematic ways in which Colombia's armed conflict has disproportionately affected women. As a heads up, we will be discussing some very sensitive and difficult topics that may be triggering to some listeners.
So even though it is an essential conversation, make sure that you are in the right emotional headspace to listen. We'll be referring testimonies from real women as reported in the final report of Colombia's Truth Commission, Hay futuro si hay verdad.
We wanted to share stories from first-hand victims, as I believe their words are more powerful than anything we could possibly say. And in the spirit of the Truth Commission, it allows us to return the narrative to the women whose voices were once stripped away.
The idea is that peace, reconciliation, and non-repetition cannot happen until we first acknowledge the atrocities that were committed. When we talk about armed conflict, we must recognize that violence against women is intentional, a deliberate tool of control that affects every area of life.
It is no coincidence that increasing conflict and militarization directly correlates with increasing violence against women. Militarization serves to reinforce patriarchal and controlling behaviors that silence women and force them to act for these male agendas.
Targeting women is tactical. Women are the heart of every community, the unifying family unit, the keepers of knowledge. By attacking women, armed actors weaken entire communities, forcing families to flee or submit, allowing men with weapons to seize control.
In one anonymous testimony, one woman recounted how, quote, "Some men came to offer me to work for them. I thought about it a lot, but the truth is I didn't really know them and they didn't give me a good feeling either. But when they saw my face, they felt that I was going to say no, and their faces and expressions changed. In a few words, they changed from asking me to forcing me. It was my turn to be there to serve them."
Women and everyone were defenseless. Threats, fear, and violence became weapons of submission. Armed men acted with total impunity. It was a power trip that often went unchecked and allowed armed actors to commit barbaric crimes against humanity without consequences.
A testimony from Rosa from the Pioya Reservation in Cauca recounts horrifying sexual violence. She was selling cholados on the Pan American Highway when 4 men grabbed her and put her in a van while accusing her of working for the guerrilla group FARC. They held her hostage and raped her for 3 days before releasing her, but then the paramilitaries would go and continue to look for her at her workplace. In her testimony, Rosa said, quote, "He would only come at night and he would say, 'It is your turn to sleep with me. You're going to have sex with me,' and I agreed, but I felt like I was throwing up. Just feeling him touch me made me want to throw up. I wanted to die and I might as well have. The night was always with someone different, and in other words, I was a whore to them."
It's impossible to imagine that kind of pain, and yet Rosa's story is one of 1,000. On top of direct violence, women also face the threat of forced recruitment by guerrilla groups and paramilitaries. It was common for armed actors to recruit young girls as young as 12 to live with them and provide sexual services and domestic duties.
There was even a tactic called enamoramiento, where men charmed girls into falling in love with them before exploiting them.
The manipulation of young girls who cannot even be called women because these are children we are talking about is absolutely disturbing. According to Elena from Buenaventura, quote, "Many of the girls that dated guys from the army and the police are now dead because they were killed by the others because they were pointed out as snitches."
In this way, women were treated as collateral damage to men who sought to assert power over other men, yet they suffered very directly.
In one horrific case, one young girl who was recruited by the AUS paramilitaries had fled and escaped. She was pregnant, and when she was captured, she was murdered. Her baby was removed and displaced as a symbol and a threat to other girls as to what would happen to those who tried to escape.
It's horrible. There are honestly no words strong enough to condemn this kind of inhumanity. But I feel this just goes to show how cruel the violence that was used to create fear to control women and children. This fear is so debilitating and all-consuming that it silences women and completely subjects them to the will of their oppressors. Later, we will see how this fear creates lifelong trauma that continues to silence women even after the conflict.
Girls from indigenous communities were disproportionately at risk for becoming victims of forced recruitment. A report from La Oficina del Defensora del Pueblo found that 50% of child recruits were from indigenous communities. Boys were obviously also recruited too, since it is easier to control and indoctrinate people from a young age, but the significant majority were girls. The Association of Indigenous Councils reported that in 2021, out of 272 children recruited, 80% of them were girls.
Also, keep in mind that the actual number is likely much higher due to underreporting. So we see one of the many reasons families fled their homes was to avoid this forced recruitment of their children. But often fleeing wasn't a choice, but rather a forced displacement. In another anonymous testimony, one woman describes the day that, quote, paramilitaries arrived, shooting and detonating a mine to blow up at the entrance to their farm. They then came into our farm and took everything. They took my brother-in-law away and killed him, and because we denounced this, they threatened us and gave us 12 hours to get out. We left without anything, just a suitcase and my children. We arrived at the city of Barranquilla and no one gave us a hand. I had to live in a shelter for a year, working hard and putting up with hunger, which had never happened to me back in my land.
Over 75% of 10,000 women interviewed in Ruta Pacifica were victims of forced displacement. As we've seen, these women were fleeing threats, forced recruitment, and violence. They fled due to assassinations of male relatives, land disposition, and property. They fled due to lack of protection and security in their own homes.
When speaking about her personal experience with displacement, Luisa, a woman from Apartado, Antioquia, said, quote, well, it changed our lives because we had to leave behind the things we loved. We are no longer the same as before because we are already becoming a part of a different culture with other customs, and the fear that remains in you for your whole life marks you. Your whole life is marked by the fear and the nostalgia that you will no longer see the people you love.
It's very hard to imagine and even sadder to recognize that life did not get easier for women after displacement. Displaced women were at higher risk of disappearance, sexual violence, exploitation, slavery, and murder. Many were left as the sole and primary providers for the family, forcing them to resort to work and domestic services or prostitution to take care of their families just to guarantee their safety.
Many women worked for armed actors of illicit economies, as we see in the cases of La Guajira and Choco. In these cases, we will notice that armed conflict disproportionately affects marginalized minority populations, especially indigenous and Afro-Colombian women. A history of structural racism, colonialism, and poverty had created vulnerable conditions for Black and indigenous women that made them more susceptible to exploitation.
So let's start with La Guajira. La Guajira is one of Colombia's departments along the northern Caribbean coast, and it is home to indigenous Wayuu people.
It is also home to a key drug trafficking corridor controlled by armed actors such as the Clan del Golfo and the Cerrojón mine. This mine is the largest mining operation in Colombia, owned by a foreign Swiss enterprise called Glencore, and it includes a 150-kilometer strip of land from the extraction site to the port, which is heavily militarized.
The mining project cuts through countless communities, disrupting the terrain and intoxicating the people. Metals and chemicals from the mines end up in rivers. Toxic emissions from the mines put the indigenous and surrounding Afro-Colombian population at high risk of cancer and innumerable health conditions. Despite housing one of Colombia's most lucrative extraction sites, La Guajira is the poorest department in the country.
This pollution and environmental destruction is especially detrimental to indigenous peoples who have deep cultural and spiritual ties to their land. Indigenous women in particular feel the spiritual effects of environmental destruction, as they are the symbolic representation of Mother Earth and responsible for the spiritual well-being and harmony of their community and land. One lady from the Kenkuoma tribe describes that for indigenous people, quote, our security lies in our territory because this is where our spirits reside. All our elements for resistance, for survival, for our protection are in El Corazón del Mundo, our territory.
And to tie it back to earlier, we know that illicit economies are accompanied by increasing presence of armed actors to control territory and people, which means we will also absorb and increase violence against women. One of the only options for work for women in these regions is domestic work in illegal mining camps. However, this puts women in direct harm for men who would go looking for prostitutes or young girls. Sexual violence against Wayuu women was committed mainly by the army and the paramilitaries.
Bernice, a Wayuu leader, explains that Wayuu warfare codes were very clear before. Women were not to be targeted, and all Wayuu clans had respected this. But when paramilitaries came and directly harmed women and children, they disrespected this and broke the entire Wayuu legal system and culture.
It's the same story in Choco, Colombia's second poorest department. where predominantly young Afro-Colombian women work in domestic camps for illicit economies, and during domestic enslavement, STDs, body mutilation, forced pregnancies, and even forced marriages to survive.
And Afro-Colombian women faced racialized hate on top of it all. Lady, a black woman from Cauca, tells her story of her torture saying, quote, "I was the only black woman and the one who was raped the most because they said that black women resist and are drier and hotter. They made me bathe more because they said my smell was stronger. They forced me to have my hair straightened because my natural hair disgusted them. They told me to eat more because the way my buttocks could grow and that gave them pleasure."
Impoverished minority women in these coastal and border regions were also at high risk of trafficking and forced disappearance. They often became the direct victims of an illicit economy built around the abuse and objectification of women, sex tourism. Colombia has a huge sex tourism industry. It was specifically evident when we visited Cartagena for our school trip. I was shocked by the amount of young girls we would see walking dressed up and walking around with old white men.
We know Cartagena relies on tourism for economic prosperity, but its economy is based off the objectification of women, especially young black women, as the subjects of consumption through sexual exploitation, subordination, and racial discrimination.
There's one horrible case in particular we want to share. It's stayed at the back of my mind ever since I learned about it, and I still struggle to wrap my head around how evil the sex tourism industry is. This case is about a child trafficking ring in Cartagena.
And the only reason we publicly know about it is because one of the victims escaped and notified authorities, leading to the arrest of their leader, a woman known as La Madame, who controlled the sale and trafficking of over 250 girls.
According to persecution, La Madame would recruit young women in poor neighborhoods and offer them jobs on beaches and hotels in Cartagena, which is in the wealthy walled city, catering to tourists. She would falsely promise them job opportunities abroad, but when the young women arrived, their documents were taken and they were imprisoned and sexually exploited.
Children were also offered up in catalogs that were shown to foreigners who could pick who they wanted at their sex parties, as if these girls were some type of high-class party favor. And on top of it all, this child sex trafficking ring organized something known as rape tours as a sick form of entertainment for foreign pedophiles. Basically, these girls were drugged and released onto the beach, where the game was men would chase them down and rape them once they were caught.
It's absolutely disgusting, and to think that there are girls out there today suffering from the same abuse is heartbreaking.
Again, we see the involvement of armed actors. In Cartagena, there have been incidents of watching girls be picked up in armored vehicles, and it's assumed that the Clan del Golfo is involved. Oftentimes, disappearance posters are taken down within a day. They do anything and everything to silence the exploitation and suffering of women.
But the suffering cannot be ignored. Even today, despite efforts such as the Truth Commission to give victims a voice, thousands of women still face enormous barriers to speaking out. Fear of retaliation, fear of not being believed, fear of being blamed or humiliated by the very institutions that are supposed to protect them.
Another problem is an accusatory patriarchal culture that has normalized violence against women and invalidates women when they try and speak out. Yesenia from Cuidovo says, quote, "It is normal for men to make demands, for the man to be the one who makes the decisions. Sexual and psychological violence has been so normalized that when a man hits a woman, the people around them assume that the woman must have done something to deserve this."
We see the same mentality implemented in the way authorities approach cases of violence against women. Rape cases are discarded by police, who deem the cases as not important or blame the victims themselves by asking derogatory questions such as, "How were you dressed?" or "Why were you out alone at night?"
Accusations such as these instill guilt and remorse in victims and conditions women to stay silent to their suffering. It is simply another form of re-victimization. These women are staying silent because they do not know who they can trust and who will believe them. Male and authority figures pose a threat to women who are traumatized by their abuse at the hands of other men.
And the problem of violence against women goes beyond the armed conflict, as stated by Viviana, who maintains, quote, "Our concern neither began nor ended with the armed conflict in Colombia. We have history that has been sustained, some aggression and violence that have been sustained from the time of colonial enslavement until now, which is perpetuated and recreated."
So, where do we go from here?
We start by naming the violence by honoring the testimonies of Indigenous women, Afro-Colombian, campesinas, queer, and displaced women, and refusing to stay silent.
And also by recognizing women not just as victims, but as leaders, organizers, protectors of their land, culture, and collective memory. Women have always been the ones holding their communities together, and they have always been agents of resistance.
Peace is not something that gets signed, it is something that is built slowly and collectively.
And it cannot be built if women remain unheard.
At the basis, institutions and the public must learn to listen, respect, and believe a woman's word.
Violence against women has been a hidden war from the beginning, and continuing long after the peace accords were signed.
A war fought a woman's body on their land and in their silence.
And in breaking that silence, we hope to take the first steps in ensuring that such crimes against women and humanity never occur again.
From McAllister College in St. Paul, Minnesota. I major in chemistry and biology, and any apologies for the disruption, I have a slight cough today.
And I am a double major in statistics and history with a focus on race and identities in my history major.
Today, we are shifting our focus to the profoundly complex consequence of decades of violence, the impacts on the environment itself. We're exploring how the armed conflict in Colombia has not only produced human victims, but has also left deep scars on the natural world. The environment, its rivers, forests, and territories have both been victim and witness of violence.
Our central question for this episode is, how does nature suffer during armed conflict, and what reparations and justice systems is Colombia enacting? We'll be drawing on academic works, specifically Stephanie Lavox's research on natural resources and conflict, and Alexandra Hunis and Pablo Ruda's study on legally recognizing territory as a victim.
To understand the severity of the damage, we must first appreciate Colombia's immense environmental diversity. The country is rich in natural resources, including tropical forests, fresh water, and abundant minerals like oil, precious gems and metals, coal, gold, and natural gas in the Guajira region.
A quote from Lavox explains Colombia has not only a wealth of natural resources, but environmental diversity. There's an estimated 45,000 to 55,000 species of plants in the country, which correspond to 16% of the Earth's total.
Exactly. And this quote points out the degree to which the environment is truly rich in Colombia, rich in the context of its biodiversity, not just materials to be exploited.
And this natural wealth creates a paradox. Lavox points out that natural abundance becomes both a source of power and a cause of violence. The geography of violence in Colombia mirrors its geographical natural wealth. Wherever there's resources are abundant, conflict intensifies.
And to truly grasp the concept of nature as victim, we need to take a look at how the land itself has been wounded. Lavox identifies three major ways that the conflict harms nature.
And the first is the exploitation of natural resources by both the state and armed groups. Armed groups found a significant source of wealth in controlling non-fuel minerals and oil, controlling coal mines in Cesar, gold mines in northern Antioquia and southern Bolivar, and oil exploitation in Arauca. This was often facilitated by the absence of state intervention.
But the state is implicated too. The Colombian state pursued similar exploitations through developmental policies that expanded oil and mining operations in conflicted regions. These state-led projects prioritized profit and natural revenue over ecological preservation, turning natural wealth into an instrument of control and exclusion.
The second method of harm we see involves armed attacks on pipelines and extraction sites. One interesting thing is that all of these attacks on oil infrastructure have been caused by FARC and ELN. And since 2000, there have been about 700 explosions to pipelines in border areas near Venezuela. These actions have spilled millions of barrels of crude oil, poisoning rivers and farmland.
Lavox states that many borders in Colombia suffer daily from the plundering, parasitic, and almost symbiotic relationship between the illegal armed actors and the natural resources. In fact, these areas, the most affected by the armed conflict, adjacent to Venezuela and Ecuador, are also the areas with the largest natural resources in Colombia.
And this relationship between violence and natural resources is no coincidence. This centralization of conflicts allows further exploitation of marginalized communities and contests the safety of the land they live on.
And finally, the third major harm comes from coca cultivation and chemical fumigation. All the steps of the coca cultivation process are highly damaging, planting illicit crops with indiscriminate deforestation, leading to the loss of tropical forest, destruction of animal and vegetable ecosystems. This causes the sedimentation of national and international rivers, such as the Amazon or Orinoco. And the chemical warfare used in the war on drugs in Colombia involved years of aerial glyphosate spray, a chemical now proven to be carcinogenic and devastating to all life it touches. So by poisoning farmland used for the cultivation of illicit crops, such as coca and marijuana, those farmers then have to respond by pushing the illicit cultivation frontier further into the environment, increasing the deforestation that occurs.
Exactly. And the process itself of coca farming and cocaine production involves a massive amount of pollutants, including up to 23 variants of pesticides and chemicals used for the coca paste and powder refinement. And as we can see, these forms of violence demonstrate how war in Colombia is deeply ecological. And this brings us to our core concept proposed by Hunis and Ruda, rethinking nature not merely as an object, but as a victim, an entity that experiences harm and deserves recognition within transitional justice.
And this idea is starting to be reflected in the work of the Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz, or JEP, which was established in 2016 as part of Colombia's peace process. The JEP is moving towards what they call eco-centered justice.
And Lavox discusses 5 resolutions issued by the GEP that connect environmental destruction directly to the armed conflict, which treats ecosystems not just as territory, but as legal subjects that have been violated and need repair.
Exactly, and we will discuss these 5 key examples that summarize this shift. The first being the resolution on the Atrato River in Choco. This declares the Atrato River Basin as subject of rights due to the extensive pollution and deforestation stemming from illegal mining and armed conflict. A second river affected is in Cauca. The case of the Cauca River and mining zones recognizes the environmental disruption from the illegal gold mining and contamination with mercury as a direct consequence of armed group control. According to the Bahia report, Cauca is one of the departments most affected by homicides. So Rio Cauca was used as a mass grave, with countless bodies of people victim to forced disappearances and assassinations being thrown into the river. The pollution of the river with chemicals and bodies has meant dire health consequences for the people living off of the Cauca River as a food source, water, and community. So the destruction of people's bodies in the river also bears the consequence of masking victims' identities. JP's work for ecological restoration must also include consultation with these affected communities, and one of those central goals is the identification of lost loved ones disappeared in the armed conflict. Therefore, attempts to heal the river are intertwined with the violent exploitation of these natural spaces.
And moving on to the third resolution, this one is on the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, and this acknowledges the territory as a victim due to paramilitary encroachment, coca cultivation, and the displacement of indigenous people, specifically the Arhuaco, the Canquamo, and the Wiwa. The GEP determined around 90,000 victims of crimes against humanities in this and the Pergia mountain range region. Violence in this region involves use of anti-personnel mines, forced disappearance and displacement, sexual violence, and the destruction of sacred spaces. All of these crimes have severe implications on the land and the manner in which these indigenous communities can engage with it. With this case, the GEP called for territorial reparations and restoration of the sacred ecological sites.
And number 4 is the resolution of the Catatumbo region. This classifies the area as a territorial victim, linking conflicts, oil exploitation, and coca cultivation, emphasizing the destruction of ecosystem as inseparable from social harm. The exposure to hydrocarbon by national and foreign companies specifically affected regions and their people here in regions such as this in Catatumbo. Attacks on oil pipelines by FARC and ELN has also severely damaged water access and contaminated drinking water with oil debris. The chemical pollution in Catatumbo is deeply related to its geographic proximity to other countries like Venezuela, who share the Catatumbo water basin, meaning international conflicts add to the pressure put on this region and the devastation of broader violence on the people and these ecological spaces.
And the fifth and final JEP resolution is the resolution on the Amazon and Caqueta areas, which address deforestation and chemical fumigation resulting from anti-narcotics operations. The growth of monocrops like coca require an excessive amount of pesticides and chemicals, which take a toll on the workers exposed to these contaminants, as well as the soil that has been having a long-lasting effect on future crops and other plants in the surrounding areas. Because of this, the GEP mandated collective reparations for both the ecosystem and affected indigenous communities in these regions.
These cases highlight a fundamental truth about Colombia, that indigenous and Afro-Colombian communities cannot be separated from their territories. Eunice and Roya argue that the land is not property, it's a living being tied to culture, spirituality, and survival.
And these communities are disproportionately affected by the conflict, as their lands are often mined, militarized, and polluted. While the law acknowledges that environmental damage affects cultural identity, it sometimes stops short of formally recognizing Black communities' territories as victims. Black and Indigenous communities played a key role in the law that created GEP during the negotiations of the peace accord in 2014.
This leads us to a crucial question for reflection. If we say a river or a forest can suffer, who speaks for that suffering? And how might this reshape legal and historical narratives about the Colombian conflict? So I think that the suffering is most clearly communicated by the communities living closest in relation to said forests and rivers. This means the Afro-Colombian and indigenous communities are most affected by the conflict damaging the environment and the relationship people can have with that land. However, the responsibility to fight and speak for the land shouldn't just be placed on the shoulders of already oppressed and victimized individuals. This is the responsibility of the state to take part in aiding nature as a victim.
But some of the issues with this that emerge are from the failure of the Colombian government to do this in the past. People lose trust in a system that not only ignores but harms them. The context of armed conflict in Colombia has created a complex dynamic which reparations and justice need to be pursued, but the avenues of doing so are messy and contested. And in response to this suffering, the GEP has begun incorporating ecological reparations, focusing on measures like restoring rivers, reforestation of damaged areas, and protecting sacred sites.
Eunice and Rueda call this a necessary expansion of justice. To repair the territory is to restore the possibility of life. This means peacebuilding must include the healing of ecosystems, not just human communities. And part of what makes the legislation from JEP and the information from the Bastaya reports is the acknowledgement at the national level to the abuses and devastation caused by the Colombian armed conflict, and to understand the violence from the government and armed groups and use such explicit terminology to showcase the severity of impact on Colombian nature and people. The use of the word suffering means so much to the community on a social scale. Samira, can you break down exactly why this terminology is so important?
Yes, what makes this so impactful in the discussion of violence in Colombia is by categorizing the environment in the humanization idea of suffering. It forces the government, international actors, and local Colombians to see that the environmental violence as a tangible, serious thing.
Exactly. Nature in Colombia has suffered from the armed conflict, and to say this means to acknowledge the reparations that must be held to heal the ecological spaces here, and to recognize the damage that has been done and will continue to hurt Colombia if not addressed.
And a key part of this future-focused justice involves non-repetition measures, such as strengthening environmental governance in post-conflict areas.
And this process requires memory. Nature itself becomes a kind of archive of violence. Polluted rivers, deforested hills, and eroded soils carry the memory of conflict. Environmental restoration, then, isn't only about recovery, it's about remembrance. It forces us to ask who is responsible for these wounds, the armed groups alone, or also the global systems that profit from the extraction and war.
And in order to truly move towards peace, Colombia must integrate environmental restoration into its post-conflict reconstruction. This means protecting biodiversity, supporting community-led conversations, and recognizing that the survival of the land and its people are fundamentally intertwined.
In short, healing in Colombia requires healing its ecosystems, and with that, the people dependent on them.
And thank you so much for joining us for this discussion today.
Yes, we hope that this episode inspires dialogue and awareness as we look at the challenges of peacebuilding in Colombia, highlighting the importance of memory, justice, and reconciliation.
En todos los rincones del mundo se escucha una voz que trasciende fronteras, conecta con historias de vida, viaja a través del tiempo y se adapta a nuevas formas de contar la información. Bienvenidos al Giro Podcast, Ciencia, Cultura y Ciudad.